Yes, who am I? Firstly, hi, I'm Pete Larkham. I am a mental health trainer, public speaker, and the creator of a product called Mentality, which I'll talk about a little bit later, which is basically spun me on a journey to try and figure out how do we start to change the culture within our workplace. Because what we're finding is that not only with lockdown, but way before lockdown, mental health was beginning to run rife within our workplace. When you look at the costs back in 2017, it was estimated approximately 36 billion. 2020, it clicked off at 45 billion. And then 2022, you're looking at 56 billion, which is more money than I have any idea how to try and equate. But it basically looks at around currently £2,750 per person per year is the annual cost of poor mental health in your workplace. So depending on how many people you have employed in your staff, that's your average cost that poor mental health is having. So that's on things like leavism, where people are taking time off work to catch up with work, or working outside of their contracted hours, which I know none of us do. But also then you've got the absenteeism, where people are just off sick, but also you've got the presenteeism, where people are at work but still not working to their full capacity. Then you've got your staff turnover. Staff turnover at the moment, if you lose someone in kind of middle management due to poor mental health, the cost to replace that person and get them up to speed is averaging around £125,000 per person, just because we didn't look after their well-being and help them stay in work. These are costs that we can avoid. And yet these are the main costs that are running rife through companies left, right and centre. So what I want to try and do is not be all doom and gloom, which mental health can sometimes be, because most of the time I deliver mental health first aid courses, which if you've ever come across mental health first aid, you talk about anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, self-harm, eating disorders and suicide. It's a happy course, you know. So I do that most of the time. So actually to try and come in and talk to people about, well, how do we actually start to look after ourselves? And then how do we begin to look after our team? Then maybe instead of escaping poor mental health and kind of mental health illnesses, we might be able to begin to look at, well, what does positive mental health actually look like within the culture of our organisation? How do we begin to move towards that? So that's kind of the trajectory that I'm on in our short time together. I've got about 40 minutes, so buckle up. It should be fun. First question for you, though, is, out of this slide, what sticks out for you? Anything? Nothing?
91% do not want to return 95 days.
Yeah, so this was basically lockdown. So at the beginning of lockdown, 100% of staff were sent home. 66% of staff had never worked from home before. And then when we said, okay, guys, are you ready? 9 to 5, Monday to Friday? 91% of the UK workforce said no. This is why we now have our hybrid working culture. And most companies now are struggling to actually advertise for a Monday to Friday 9 to 5 job. There has to be an element of working from home, this hybrid working, just to get people to apply for the jobs. Now, obviously, that's not necessarily the same within the likes of construction or engineering, where you have to be present to be able to do your job. But certainly office jobs, to try and get people back into the office 9 till 5 isn't happening. I mean, we heard just this week that HSBC are pulling out of Canary Wharf because they just aren't getting the people back into the offices as they were before. This is
another thing, or was that UK one? Because I just wondered now if they've got mental health and people actually do want to get back to work, or they actually want that.
Yes. So what we're talking about then is about the people who do want to be back in the office, and are they able to get back into the office, versus the people who have quite enjoyed this hybrid working, the 9 to 5 kind of Tuesday to Thursday, maybe having Monday, Friday, not work from home. So yes, there's definitely those people out there. They're just not the majority. And so then it's also about recognizing that if you're not getting people back into the office, why are we paying for all this space all the time? And that's what we're finding. So I work with City Point up in Moorgate, and they said that out of all the companies that are in their building, they haven't even reached 50% back in the office at any one time, which is staggering for a city centre building. And this isn't just London, so this is actually right across the country.
Do you see the movement of people mandate people do come back to the office? So people like Disney and Tesla are now saying, we were able to do this, but now we want you back.
So that's definitely beginning to become a trend. But also what you are then teetering on the edge of is that people will vote with their feet. So when companies are saying you have to be back, then people just go, no, I'll go and find somewhere else. So then you're looking at, well, what's the incentive to get people back? Now, I work with a company in London, and they've decided that they are putting in tribe days. So once every month, once every couple of months, they say, you can work from home, you can have this fluid working, but on this day, we want everyone in. And what they used to do is they used to then kick the day off with breakfast. Then they used to have a completely social morning of just catching up with each other, have some lunch together, and then they'd finish at 2:00. Everyone would go home. And it was purely a social day. And so what they've now done is, because the workload is picking back up again, they said, look, we want you back in the office and we'll have lunch together. So you can be working in your own little kind of sections, but as long as we have a break between, and they go for 12:30 till 2, so as everyone can come together and we can just have a buffet lunch, and it just keeps that connection. And that's worked really well for them. But also I've worked with companies where they are bigger companies, so they can't get the entire staff in, but they can get specific teams in. So then it's the manager's responsibility to get their team together and do something where they are all in the same place at the same time, on a fairly ad hoc but kind of regular basis. So that's kind of all in with that. Great questions. Any other questions?
There isn't an infinite amount of jobs though, is there? So people say I'm going to leave, but eventually if every company says, well, we want you in, eventually they can't, can they? Eventually it's going to be, you can get back where you work.
Yes, and this is where we need to start asking the question of, if all the companies start saying, no, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, this is what we want, then you limit people's ability. And there is partly a question around, well, why are we forcing it? What's the need to force it? And then you go, well, productivity, weirdly, during lockdown, didn't diminish. If anything, it improved, which is a weird one because people were working from home, having not worked from home before, and this whole...
And anxiety does make people worry about the job.
Yes.
So it went up, people were doing more than perhaps they used to originally.
What you're then tackling in the context of kind of raise of anxiety is the actual fear of redundancy. That was the thing that was fueling, was this horrid underlying process of, if I don't get myself back into the workplace, how long is it going to be until they start realising, hang on, we've done without this job for the last 2 years, do we really need someone in it?
Whereas now, where people go back to the office of the anxiety, so people were doing more work, and so the productivity went up. What we're now seeing, just generally out there, is some people start getting a bit more settled and comfortable and thinking, I can get away with this and I can do... So actually, some of the home environment, I'm not saying it's in every sector, but... I think
it's a great conversation to have, because actually what we're fighting in this whole conversation is the argument between 9 to 5 and productivity. Because you may not necessarily need to be in the office 9 to 5 to hit the same level of productivity, and sometimes the 9 to 5 grind isn't as productive as actually this is the task that you wanted to do. So there is a whole load of other conversations that need to be done within the workplace to begin to assess, how do we measure what productivity actually really looks like? And can we ensure that our teams are growing rather than staying stagnant, or worst case scenario, depleting because people are just leaving? And so it is this whole kind of, how do we begin to look at, well, okay, how do we look after people and begin to figure out how that impacts on our work, so as we can actually be looking at productivity and positive mental health in the whole mix. I was working with a law firm, I'm working with a law firm, and within the law firm, there are moments where they get absolutely bamboozled. You know, a case is coming up, you're in 24/7 until this is done. And they call it a specific word, which I won't repeat. But the thing is that that's part of the culture of the working industry for them. And I'm not saying, well, I'm sorry, that's not good enough. You have to kind of not do that anymore. That's not right. But it is saying, within the culture of how you are working, how do you help when you're not doing that to be looking after your staff better? So as when you say, we're on now, everyone's like, actually, I'm fresh, I'm ready, let's do this. And there's actually a positive buzz rather than this, oh my gosh, I'm so exhausted, and yet you're wanting me in to do that. And then we're pushing people towards burnout and other horrid words like that. So it is about trying to understand your industry and what is normal for your industry. But also there is a question in what we're trying to explore, which is what is going on within the culture of your organization that may actually be contributing to or causing poor mental health. And that's the harder question. And this is things like out of hours emails. When do we encourage our staff to stop working? When people go on holiday and then they say, I'm on holiday, and then they start responding to emails. Oh, hang on, you're sending a message to everyone that I need to still be on when I'm on holiday. Is that the culture that we're working in? And so it is about trying to understand those things. What are the things that we can do? What are the things we can change? Because actually, we're trying to reduce the costs. We're trying to increase the productivity. We're trying to engage our workforce so as they feel like they're thriving. Thriving is a good word, because the opposite is striving. Are you striving or are you thriving? Because there is a significant difference if I'm literally just getting from one day to the next, to the next, to the next, to the weekend, to the next. A lot of people are in that kind of just about surviving, or are they really thriving in their workplace? And so that's what we're trying to tackle and trying to look at around positive mental health. So anything else on this before we kind of move on? These are great questions, by the way. I love it. In that case,
I was going to just say that 39% increase, and I'm just going to speak from experience from my wife, actually, because she now works 2 days a week in the office, 3 at home. When she's at home, she doesn't have, I know she doesn't stop for lunch, but she might take her lunch and sit at her desk. And then she's working until last night, she didn't finish at 20 to 8.
yes.
And I wonder if, because it goes back to she's not in the office, so that productivity may not be slow as far as business is concerned, but from the person's point of view, they can't actually interact with and do the work they need to in that 8 hours.
Yes.
So they're doing 10, 12 hours a day.
Yes.
Because they can't have the interaction. So the productivity as far as business is fine, but that person's mental health is just not good.
And I think this is it, is that we're trying to find the balance.
Yeah.
And unless we can create an openness within our staff to be able to share what's going on, there becomes a simple assumption that people are doing okay. So this is certainly where the idea of leavism is quite important, where we are working outside of our hours. Because what you're doing with leavism is you are working more hours, which is leading you to a place of burnout or stress or whatever. And so we then leave that job. And then we look back and we find that 2 people have been employed where we were. Have you had that happen? Because people are suddenly like, oh, hold on, you can't do all this work in 40 hours. You've got to have 2 people do it. How are they coping? Or they weren't. And we've lost them. But actually, if they have the confidence to say, hang on, I'm taking on too much. I need to put some boundaries in place. And that becomes a healthy place. And actually employ somebody else. Then you've still got the productivity and the engagement of this person. You've saved yourself the £125,000 to replace them. And you simply brought someone alongside and you then share the load. Now, there's also this question around, but then we're just increasing our costs. But otherwise, you're losing a whole heap of money. And it is this, how do we have the conversations so as we start to see, well, what is positive mental health? What does that look like? Because at the moment, we are pushing people further and further, harder and harder, to the point where they don't feel safe within their workplace. So either they go off sick, and then we're talking long-term sickness, which is if somebody is off sick with their mental health for over 6 months or more, less than half of those people ever return to work. That's a horrid statistic. And then less than half of the number that do return to work return to their place of work. And so that's kind of the cost implications that we're then talking about. So the hardest part of this is actually beginning to say, okay, so what might be contributing to this? And actually getting those conversations going, because there's got to be a bit of a hand on heart that says, how do we do this better? And that means we need to find the things that aren't working. And it's a tough conversation to have with people. Right, let's move on, otherwise I'm going to completely run out of time. So why is it so important to get this conversation going? We recognise and we understand that there has been a significant impact on people's mental health. 41% of symptoms have been caused or worsened in this last year. we've got to talk about suicide rates, because actually men aged 20 to 49 are your highest suicide risk. 40 to 49 is the pinnacle. But it's not something that we really talk about. Women are 3 times more likely to get a diagnosis of mental health illnesses, but that might be because women are just better at reaching out and getting help and support. Blokes, on the other hand, we just shut it down. And so then it's about, okay, within the culture of an organisation, how do we help our men talk about it more? How do we actually engage with people so as they can ask for help rather than the, you all right? Am I? You all right? Am I? I've got nothing out of this conversation, you know? And so what I want to do is I want to begin to explore with you, how do we start changing the questions so that we can start changing the answers we're getting from the people that we work with. So,
what do you think is contributing to those numbers?
What, the suicide risks? I mean, suicide in general has been a fairly horrid statistic for a long time.
Okay, so it's not getting any better or worse?
It's getting worse,
Okay.
But when you begin to look at mental health illnesses, let me try and explain it like this. If you imagine that I have a door, and through that door are signs and symptoms of mental health illnesses, stress will push us closer to the door. The more stressed we are, the closer to the door we become. But if I can stay on this side, I'm not going to get the diagnosis of mental health illnesses. So then the question is, okay, so how far away from the door do I pull myself? Because then when significant life events happen, car accident, death in the family, relationship breakup, those stresses will push me closer to the door, but at least I then stay on this side. My fear is what happens if I'm already next to the door and then the significant life event happens? Because it's that thing that's going to push me over. And because of the cultures that we're creating within the workplace, we are actually putting more and more stresses on people, pushing them closer to the door without them ever really realising, because nobody is ever stopping and saying, are you okay at the moment? What's actually going on? And what's the impact, and how do we get you help and support? So there is this kind of fear. And we've got to remember that mental health illnesses are a life-threatening illness. We just don't often see it like that. But people die from mental health illnesses just like they do from any other organ failure. And so it's about how do we begin to put the protections in place to keep people as far away from the door as possible rather than clicking over. That was a very long-winded answer. Okay? So we know, especially that during periods of change, welcome to the last 2 to 3 years, we know that with additional demands and general working practices that we may be increasing our staff's risk. But also we may be increasing our own risk without even realising. And so I am going to get a little bit kind of more direct with you in a little bit. Good luck with this. So, how do we get this conversation started? So let's go back to the question of, you all right? If you ask someone, you all right? I'm almost certain you don't care what the response is. How do I know this? Because you ask this as you're walking past someone. You all right? You all right? You all right? Brilliant. And you carry on walking. Whereas even if you were to go, you all right? And they were like, no, not really. Yeah, me too. See you later. And you still keep walking because you don't actually care what the answer is. And this is quite a horrid statement. But then it's about, well, how do we get the conversation started? How do we begin to get people to realise that there is other stuff going on in your life? I went through a period just last year where a close friend of ours died from cancer. And I was going through this grieving process. And somebody said, you all right? The answer is yes, I am all right. Am I grieving? Yeah. But also, am I coping? Yep. Can you see how this question doesn't give you anything? So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to answer these questions for me. Question number one, I feel like I'm in a pub quiz. What is your thorn? If you can ask these 3 questions to everybody that you are connected with, you'll start to find you get different answers. So what do I mean by what is your thorn? Because it's a weird question, isn't it? Now, have you ever been gardening? You've got your gardening gloves on, you feel totally protected, so you go for the rose bush, thorn bush, holly bush, and the thorn goes through the glove and into your thumb. You have a moment where you then go, it's not life-threatening, It's just blooming painful. You take the thorn out, take your glove off, your thumb's bleeding. What's going on in your life at the moment that's prickly? You don't like it. It's uncomfortable. This is your first question. What's going on in your life at the moment that is prickly, uncomfortable, you don't like it? Depending on who you're with will depend on how deep you go. Because you may go, I broke a nail. Or you may go, I'm really worried about my mum. She had a fall the other day and I don't quite know what that means. Depending on who you're with will depend on how deep you go. My thorn is that we've just had our mortgage meeting. Our mortgage renews in November. This is not the time in the world that you want to remortgage. And we're going from a 1.9% to a 5 point something percent. Scares the heebie-jeebies out of me. That's my thorn at the moment because I'm trying to figure out what impact does this really have. What's your thorn? What's the prickly stuff that's going on in your life at the moment that is uncomfortable? Have a think. I'm going to come back and ask for an answer. Question number two. What is your bud? Now, the bud is something you're looking forward to, but this needs to be tangible and it needs to be realistic, okay? So in the next 24 to 48 hours, that means the weekend is just too far away. What are you looking forward to? It could be, I'm going to meet up with some friends, going to go for a walk. It could be, I'm going to go and sit in my hot tub, if you have a hot tub. It could be, I'm going to go to the pub. It could be, I'm going to binge watch Netflix. But it is something that is in your diary, or it is something that you could put in your diary in the next 24 to 48 hours. What are you looking forward to? Question number 2. Question number 3. So what is your rose? Now, the rose, again, needs to be tangible and realistic. So I'm going to say, in the last 24 hours, what's happened in your world that is good? Okay? So I have 4 boys at home. I have a 10-year-old, a 7-year-old, a 5-year-old, and an 8-month-old. Okay, so we get them all off to school and then we decide to start again. But for me, my rose is walking down this morning, seeing that my kids had made breakfast and there wasn't breakfast cereal all over the floor. You know, that's a winner in my world. So what's your rose? What has happened in the last 24 hours that's been good? And again, it could be, I got a takeaway the other night. It could be, I just sat and read with my kids. It could be, I went for a really nice walk with a friend. Could be what? So this is where I'm now going to ask you for some answers. I'd like 2 people to answer each of these questions for me. Okay, not the same 2 people, so it'll be different people, but I would like to ask, has anyone got a thorn? Something that you're willing to share that is currently prickly going on in your life?
I don't mind sharing.
Go for it.
I'm in a relatively new relationship, so 2 years in, all very good to start with. Now I'm worried that he is too miserable and he's taking my sparkle away. But I really love him and I want it to work.
Yes.
But at what point do you move away and say, do you know what? It's just not working. Because I don't want that at all.
Yeah.
But
Thank you.
That's prickly.
It is prickly.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else?
So I have 2 really good friends who I'm now not very good friends with. So if I say loss of a friend is that we're not friends anymore, and I'm uncomfortable with that.
Great. Not great, but thank you.
Yes.
Wrong word. Thank you. That's really tough. Question number 2. Buds. What are you looking forward to in the next 24 to 48 hours? The weekend doesn't count. Go on then.
My husband's going away for the night, which is great.
That's brilliant. What are you looking forward to? He's going away. The house is mine.
The house is mine.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? What's your bud?
I'm meeting with my dad on the weekend, actually, for the first time for about 6 months. Face to face.
Winner. Thank you very much. Anyone? What's your rose? Got any roses out there? Things that have happened in the last 24 to 48
So
hours.
I've been away for 24, 48 hours, and this morning when my daughter walked up, woke up and came to the room.
That's a great one. Thank you. Anyone else?
I didn't drink last night.
Trying to assess whether that's actually a good thing or not. Oh, well done. So, why does this become an important process? Because if you start to ask this of your teams, you start to learn more about them. Now, it doesn't mean you have to fix anything or solve anything. But what it does mean that, you know what, in 5 days' time, when you suddenly bump into each other because you're going to go and get a cup of coffee at the same time, you go, hey, I remember what you said the other day. I just want to check in. Are you okay? You know? You were really looking forward to your husband going away. How was it? I'm not... I'm not prying. Can you see the difference? I'm asking. Because it's information that you've given me. I did this in a conference where I was online, had 250 people on the call. I couldn't see anyone, so I was delivering training to myself. And I asked these questions and got people to write it down in the chat bar. And the chat bar went berserk. And it went berserk because people were suddenly going, oh, I never knew. That sounds really tough. Oh, that sounds so exciting. I've got this going on as well. And they all started to chat to one another on the chat bar about the stuff that was coming out, because you suddenly get the reality of people's lives. Otherwise, I've got, so you all right? Yeah. I learn nothing. I often have companies coming to me saying, Pete, can you teach us how to have mental health conversations? What the heebie-jeebies are they, you know? But even if I was to say, oh, so tell me, what's going on in your life at the moment? It still feels like I'm getting a crowbar prying information out of you. Give me something. But if I begin to notice that you're a little bit more short-tempered with people, or you're just not your usual normal level of weird, whatever that is, I start to notice it, and I say, hey, should we go for a walk? We go for a walk. And I say, come on then, we haven't done this for a while. What's your thorn at the moment? I am almost 100% sure you will tell me what's going on without me ever having to do any digging, because it's become a normal part of our conversation, you know? When you think about all the people you know of in your world, how many of those people would you feel comfortable having a deeper, more emotionally charged conversation with? The answer comes back 2, maybe 3 people if you're lucky. If you're really going through some stuff, then who are you going to go and talk to? Sometimes no one. Go on.
I like what you said about you don't have to fix it. Because I think a lot of the reason why managers or anybody doesn't open up conversations because they're scared of what's going to come out and how to handle what comes out.
Yes.
And that they've got a bit of appropriate for dealing with whatever comes out.
And as managers, we are in a management position because we are there to solve the problem.
We think we are.
We try to. But the thing is that you start telling me about stuff and I'm there going, right, well, what you should do is, and we try and fix it. When you begin to look at stress, which we're going to do about now, you begin to realise that by taking control of somebody else's stuff, you are actually making them more stressed, because you're not empowering them to take on their own stuff. You're taking their stuff and trying to fix it, you know? So then let's go into the conversation about stress. This is probably linked to your prickly stuff. But I'd like you to take a moment and just have a think. What's going on in your life at the moment that you're stressed about? Okay? I'm going to go around the room and I'm going to ask you for one thing that's currently making you stressed. Okay? A little bit different to the prickliness. This is just stressy. Okay? So have a think. Okay, which way around the room are we going to go? Time.
It's time the same. Because business owner, you never switch off. Trying the children. Husband, just everything, just and also just trying to be aware to look after myself a bit in the middle of that, which can feel really guilty.
Absolutely. Okay. Anyone else?
Exactly the same.
What they said. Yeah. Isn't it interesting how we are time poor, and yet we want to be plugged in all the time? How often do we actually put our phones to the side and just switch off? And allow ourselves to sit with silence or to go for a walk and not get sucked in. You know? Either we're listening to music or we're listening to a podcast or we're kind of engaging with something somewhere. We rarely ever just quieten our minds. There's a great organisation out there called Shine Offline. And it's about how do we get our staff to switch off. And it's a good practice to have. So then we begin to look at this idea of we have a container, and the size of our container is different from one person to the next. Your container may be the size of a tanker, mine may be the size of a thimble, which means we can deal with different amounts of stress. But also, we've got different things going on that are making us stressed. But it becomes very easy for me to judge you based on my container and my stresses. And so you walk in the office and go, oh, I'm so stressed out. You know what? Spend a day in my shoes. Then you'll know what stress is. So I have 4 boys at home. My brother, on the other hand, he has 9 kids. I know! So 7 girls, 2 boys, 24 and 6. 18 years of pregnancy, if you want to try and figure it out. But if I was to walk in at Christmas time and see my brother with his 9 kids sipping on a cup of tea, I lean on the table and I say, I'm so tired. He's going to look at me with these condescending eyes. You don't even know you're born. Does it make my tiredness irrelevant? No. Different. But we can so easily judge other people because what they are going through is different from ours with a different sized container, and yet every single one of us will have a tipping point. The problem is we don't know where that is until everything begins to cascade. They say it's the last drop that has the biggest explosion or the straw that breaks the camel's back. It's that kind of feeling. But if we are constantly pushing ourselves and pushing ourselves and pushing ourselves and pushing ourselves, how close are we allowing ourselves to get before one more thing comes into our container and everything goes wrong? Can you see what I'm trying to say? Because there are days when you're spinning all the plates and somebody comes in and says, could you just... And your response is... because you don't have the capacity. But there are other days when you feel like you're spinning all the plates and somebody says, could you just... And you're like, yeah, actually, I have capacity for this right now. And you take it on. Ebbs and flows, doesn't it? But I guarantee you that if you have stuff going on that's making you stressed, the people around you have other stuff going on that's making them stressed. But until we begin to open up the conversations to say, so what is going on in your container? Is there anything I can help with? How do we support you? How do we help you thrive? You know, I don't need to fix the situation. But maybe by knowing that it's going on in the background and I say, oh, could you just... And you go, ugh! I might have just a little bit more grace to be kind to you. Somebody said to me, do you think we've lost the ability to be kind to one another? Sometimes. Because the thing is that if you snap at me, I have been waiting for somebody to help me unleash everything I've got going on. Have you ever had those moments? Please tell me I'm not alone in this. You know, somebody snaps. You go, you want to be like that with me? Here, have some of... We react in kind, don't we? We all have a normal level of weird, you know? But if I can know what your normal level of weird is, I might start to notice if it starts to shift and change. Yeah? So there's so much more that I could talk about, but when we begin to piece it all together, life changes. There's a whole heap of stuff going on in this slide. The stresses that are going on, not only for us, but for the people that we are supporting. So how do we begin to change the culture of the workplace that's not saying, oh, let me solve everything for you, but it is saying, you know what? We'd love to be able to support you as you go through this stuff. Yes, we'd love to be a safe place for you. Could that change some stuff? Maybe. And that's what we're trying to say, is that actually what does positive mental health look like? Because what I'm aware of is that I am offering a rainbow and a pot of gold at the bottom, which almost feels completely unobtainable. But what I do want to do is say, you know what, you can take a step towards it. What is that step? Let me start talking about that whole marginal gains. What's the one thing that you could change by just 1% that has a cascading knock-on effect to the rest of your team? Talking and learning how to listen is key. We can talk more about that if you'd like to. Okay, I'm aware of time. I've got about 30 seconds before my time runs out. So I mentioned earlier about this idea of changing the culture. So one of the things which I'm trying to do in companies at the moment is find ways to change the culture. So I created Mentality, and Mentality is an online training course that is designed for 100% of your staff. It doesn't talk about mental health illnesses because it's only an hour. But what it does talk about is good days bad days, life. Anyone ever had a good day? Anyone ever had a bad day? Welcome to your mental health journey. But if you start to have more bad days than good, then the question is, so who do you need to go and talk to? And then it talks about, in your company, do you have mental health first aiders? If you've never come across mental health first aid, it is basically people in your company who are there, trained to help signpost you to appropriate professional help. And so that may be through your employee assistance program, if you have one, or it may be through GP, counsel referral, therapy. It may be, actually, we could begin to look at reasonable adjustments or duty of care or other things like that. There are a lot of things that you can put in place through your company that are helping to support the well-being of your staff. Mental health first aiders are trained to do that. So we're trying to hit 100% of your staff. We're also trying to train about 10% of your staff, because when you think about, I might work in a team of about 10 people, that's where I might notice your normal level of weird is starting to shift and change, you know? And it's those mental health first aiders that are then your touch point. But also, we've just launched a manager's course, and we've called it the manager's course. I probably could be more creative with our title, but it's for anyone who's in a management or leadership position. Because what we're aware of is that those people begin to shape the culture of their team. And if you can begin to look at the culture of a team, maybe we could start having some pockets within our organisation where we have a positive mental health culture and people are able to access help and support quicker. And then what we're launching in the autumn term is a C-suite training for senior executives, because we want to try and hit this from the bottom up, but also when we begin to help the senior management understand the culture of their organisation and start implementing these seasonal changes, it begins to cascade from the top down as well. Then you can start to see that a culture starts to shift within our workplace where positive mental health becomes our ultimate aim. When you look at culture through a mental health lens, there's an awful lot that we can do to prevent costs. Worst case scenario, prevent death. I had a company that I've worked with for the last 7 years, and they emailed me just this week and they said, one of our staff has just disclosed to their team that they have a suicide plan. What do we do? And so I went through the stuff that they are already doing. They said, we're doing that, that's great, but is there any training to support the people who are supporting the people? But my immediate response was, you know what? Having worked with you for 7 years, we've created a culture where somebody feels able to share with their team that they have a plan. We just saved someone's life. And we've saved the knock-on effect and the ripple effect that that would have for the entire team, because they feel safe. And so now what we're talking about is, what other trainings we need to do when the crisis does arise, so as we can protect people to the best of our ability. You know, this is the stuff we're talking about. Suicide risk is very, very real. And it's horrific. And most people say we never saw it coming. And so my question is, how do we begin to help people, 100% of the staff, know that I might be having more bad days than good? I think I need to go and talk to someone. If only I had more time. But are there any questions? I could talk for days about this stuff. I don't know whether you realise that, but are there any other questions on any of the stuff that I've talked about? In that case, this is where I then say, I've been Pete Malcolm, you guys have been absolutely awesome. Thanks very much for having me.